I would now like to welcome our second speaker on the side of the opposition, Abraham Al-Hayali. Abraham is a first-year postgraduate student at St Edmund's College reading law. He won this slot through open audition. Abraham, the floor is yours.
The difficulty with being second is that after listening to three speakers and someone from the audience speaking in opposition and in abstention and in defense of the royal family, is that half my speech is now useless. And I have to kind of scavenge together the skeletons of the messages that I was trying to get across. But I would like to quote the member that came before me in that the House of Windsor hasn't failed. We have to ask ourselves, what is the House of Windsor meant to do? Some people's answer to this question is that they serve a symbolic value. Some ardent royalists might say, no, they serve a true political value. And while I wouldn't necessarily go that far, I would say that there is a value in the kinds of ideals that they support and they promote, both in the context of Britain and internationally. This is going to be a realist defense of the House of Windsor. Whilst I am going to talk about the heritage that they represent and the cultural value that they provide, this isn't going to be a plea based on the good old past. Rather, I want us all to seriously evaluate the accomplishments of the House of Windsor, however small or large, and compare it to their failures again, however small or large. I want this union to realize that while there has been many a scandal, admittedly, their failures do not overshadow their accomplishments. Again, I want to emphasize that we need to think about the cumulative benefit that they provide. As I said before, I'll be addressing both their shortcomings and accomplishments. I'll touch on recent and not so recent scandals, as well as the types of initiatives that the House of Windsor has advocated for, and address the overall benefit that they provide to society. So let's first address scandals, and the one that's been brought up a few times now is Prince Andrew. There's a few points. First, when thinking about what he's done, in thinking about the broader context of the history of the House of Windsor, it would be a mistake to think that this is a common or reoccurring problem. Which brings us to point two. I want to emphasize that a defense of the House of Windsor is a defense of the institution that is Windsor. Some components of the whole may be faulty, but we need to be especially careful to not draw a broad stroke and paint everyone in his vicinity with the same guilty verdict, especially when it comes to his family. Again, the actions of Prince Andrew, horrifying as they are the actions of Prince Andrew, not those of the Queen, and not those of his family, and certainly not those that are the institution of Windsor. He and he alone, go for it.
Do you seriously believe that the House of Windsor can't be tainted by the actions of individual members?
The dangerous part of accepting that argument would be that, let's say your brother got into a car accident, you would be partially guilty for that. I would rather leave the onus and the burden of what Prince Andrew did with Prince Andrew. The Queen didn't help him find children. Go for it. Oh, or not? Oh. Yeah.
Is it not significant that you keep saying Prince Andrew? If it's just about him as an individual, is he not just Andrew Windsor? But you're referring to him by his office. You're noting that he is, in part of the House of Windsor.
I'm not referring to him as by his office because I'm not saying he's the Duke. The name that we commonly refer to Prince Andrew by is Prince Andrew, and it's quite rare for me to say Elizabeth Windsor instead of Queen Windsor when we're upset with the Queen, but it's just the name. Let's not think too hard about it. And let's go to the last point, which is that there's no common doctrine in England that is the doctrine of collective criminal responsibility. We need to be extremely careful about the kinds of blame that we assess and where we put that blame. But on a broader note, be it Megxit or Sweatgate, the royal family isn't any stranger to being on the front pages of the morning papers. And the majority of the time, they're on those papers for quite innocuous reasons. And I went online and I looked at the front papers that reference the royal family today. And three of the biggest headlines are: one, how the Queen shamed Charles for putting gratification before duty. The second, royal wars, how Queen mocked Margaret Thatcher's accent and tried to undermine her. And lastly, weirdly by the New Zealand Herald, the Queen's secret Facebook account revealed. This kind of publicity, admittedly not entirely negative, is the kind of publicity that we frequently hear about. And the House of Windsor, including spouses and children, represents about 101 individuals spread across 4 generations. Are we really surprised by the idea that spread across 100 people, there are some bad and admittedly some hideous apples? In fact, I would be more impressed if a family that large managed to stay entirely consistent and on message. Now, undoubtedly, and quite reasonably, many of you are going to think about the kinds of bad apples we have in our own family, and how, in contrast, our bad apples are, for the most part, harmless. But this is an example of how important it is to maintain perspective, how important it is to be aware of the power of proportionality. Given their level of access and prominence, any mistake or failure committed by any member of the royal family is going to have a far greater impact than you or I, and this isn't a problem that's unique to the House of Windsor. This is an issue that CEOs, prime ministers, religious leaders all have to deal with. Realistically speaking, no one is going to intelligently argue that we should cancel Tesla because of Elon Musk's interesting interview with Joe Rogan or his, again, interesting way of demonstrating the integrity of the Cybertruck's glass windows. Those are an example of a personal failure, not an institutional one. We need to be aware that a failure of a royal to act in a particular way is not the same as a failure of royalty. This is the difference between having a failure and being one. And now I want to discuss the benefit that they provide. Beyond the pageantry, the House of Windsor has played a significant role in shaping the world that we live in. Other than Prince Charles's Black Spider memos, which you've mentioned, the House of Windsor realistically has no primary impact in forming foreign and domestic public policy, but they do play a significant role in facilitating politics, in opening up avenues for discussion. Namely, why else would the Commonwealth of Nations happily meet on a biannual basis? Realistically speaking, Canada, Jamaica, and Papua New Guinea aren't meeting in Buckingham Palace to celebrate their history of having a brutal colonialist past. They meet because their sharing of a head of state creates opportunities to discuss and collaborate. Through their fundamental role in the Commonwealth of Nations, it can be argued that the House of Windsor is responsible for promoting democratic ideals and notions of responsible government. Since 1995, 4 countries, Nigeria, Pakistan, Fiji, and Zimbabwe, have had their membership in the Commonwealth family suspended based on violations of the Harare Declaration. This declaration came heavily endorsed by the Queen, which, quote, established the goals and values of the Commonwealth, including the promotion of democracy, human rights, good governance, the rule of law, individual liberty, egalitarianism, free trade, multilateralism, and world peace. This, go for it. Yeah.
Is there not a more effective way of promoting democratic ideals and egalitarianism than an unelected and inherently privileged institution?
I would give merit to the idea that we should constantly put power in democratic institutions, but they have no practical political power in forming legislation. They're merely sponsors of these institutions. They're not actually going to the World Trade Organization and dictating to them what they can and cannot do. And in that sense, I would say they should have a democratic mandate. But they're not forming public and foreign policy on their own. Yeah.
Is that not then the definition of hypocrisy? We call out for democracy and yet we ourselves refuse to abide by it.
No, because we can have, I can advocate for institutions, and celebrities can advocate for causes that they care about. We don't need to publicize everything. We can have values that we advocate for without publicizing everything. And we need to think about a family having values that they advocate for.
Clearly well received by the House, so audition, but we do have to get on with proceedings tonight.
I want to look at how these symbols have produced change, and I'll give a practical example. On June the 3rd, just last year, at 8:51 a.m., US President Donald Trump tweeted that the mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, saying, quote, he's done a terrible job as mayor of London. He's been foolishly nasty to the visiting president of the United States, the most important ally of the United Kingdom. He's a stone-cold loser who should focus on crime in London and not me, end quote. Literally 9 hours, 15 minutes, and one royal banquet later, Donald Trump updated his Twitter account saying, quote, "The Queen and the entire royal family have been fantastic. Their relationship with the United Kingdom is very strong. Tremendous crowds of well-wishers that love our country." He finishes that tweet with a second saying, quote, "Also, big trade deal is possible once the UK gets rid of shackles. Already starting to talk."
On that point.
No. This, because I want to finish, I have 1 minute. This goes back to the House of Windsor's role in facilitating politics. It might be disingenuous for me to claim that but for the House of Windsor, we wouldn't be having these trade agreements. But it also would be equally disingenuous to claim that they had no role in encouraging presidents through pomp and circumstance and ceremony to be at least a little bit more pro-England than they normally would have otherwise. I'll finish by talking about the kinds of bar that this sets. A vote for this motion is a vote that says tabloids and intra-family feuds are more important than the revenue they generate, is more important than the values they represent, and is more important than their purpose as a unifying force in this country. We need to rise up beyond this overly simplistic way of thinking that the House of Windsor is a simple negative or positive. The value that they generate cannot be properly determined by simply looking at headlines. The value they generate is more subtle, but it has a very real impact on our lives. This facet of British heritage is unique. You cannot market them, you cannot advertise them, you cannot franchise them. Instead, they market us and they advertise us. And in the words of President Johnson, they serve us with dignity and grace and spirit and joy, and that's much more than I can say for some of our elected politicians in Westminster. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Abraham, for your speech.